Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming at you with the last Epoch video, and this time it's going to be about crafting. I'm going to teach you guys how to craft some gear. It'll probably be pretty important for you guys to learn that, especially coming from the story into the end game, because most of your gear is probably going to be pretty trash, so we're going to figure out how to do that. And the first thing is I want to talk about shards. I left this chest open, we're going to open because it's going to drop shards, so I can show you guys how that works. So you'll see we got glyphs on the ground, which are crafting items. We'll talk about those a little bit later. And then we also have increased cold damage. You see here it says it's an Epoch shard, and those are primarily what you're going to be using to craft. So pick that up, pick these things up, right? And then that's a decent crafting base for me, but okay, I'll snag that just in case we want to use it. And we're going to open up our inventory, and we see we've got the shards in our inventory. We've got a chance to ignite shard, a cold damage shard, and hitting F brings up the forge, which is our crafting bench, essentially, in this game. And this is where we do the crafting. You put the item in here, where it's kind of like glowing a little bit, and you can start putting stuff on it. Now, in order to get the shards into here, you actually have to click store crafting items. I'm not sure why it doesn't go in there automatically. It's probably something that'll be changed in the future, but basically you pick the shards up off the ground and then click store crafting items, and it adds them to this. You won't be able to use them unless they're inside of this. I tried dragging them on top of items before and stuff like that. It doesn't work. So you have to put the items in here, and the shards have to already be in here. Your glyphs automatically and your runes automatically seem to go into these two slots. So that's the very first thing. And then in terms of how these work, so every item, I'll just toss an item in here for now, has two prefixes that it can have and two suffixes. And if an item's blue, it has two mods. If it has three or more mods, it becomes yellow. There's not really a big difference between those items aside from it just denotes the number of potential mods on the item. So if you see a blue item on the ground, it can have up to two mods. If you see a rare item on the ground, a yellow one, that means it can have up to 4 mods. Unlike in PoE or something like that, there's no special way that you have to convert a blue item to a rare item. You can simply just add mods on it through the crafting bench, and it will naturally, just become rare. So I can actually probably do that right now with this. I'll put maybe I'll put some armor on this, right? Suffix, and you'll see it go from it was blue and now it's rare, right? So just to tell you a little bit about the mods and the tiers while we're here. So tier 5 is actually the best in this game, and tier 1 is the worst. So as you can see, when I put that armor mod on, it went to tier 1, which is the lowest, and that's going to happen when you put these affix shards on. They basically put on the mod that they say in their name. So this is added armor, adds tier 1 armor as a suffix, and if the item didn't have any armor on before, like this one, or it didn't have an armor mod on it, it puts tier 1 armor. If this was already on there, right, so let's say it already has tier 1 armor like this, and then I go to do it again, it adds tier 2 armor. So it just pumps it up by 1. Like I said, the max is 5 in this game, so it's kind of like the opposite of PoE, where the tier 1 is the best, right? In this game, tier 1 is the worst, tier 5 is the best. Now, we're going to get into doing more crafting in a second, but I just wanted to explain the real meat and potatoes of this crafting system, which is the instability system. So the idea is that when you craft an item, it takes instability damage, and the more unstable an item is, the higher its instability stat, the more likely it has a chance on breaking on the next time you try and put a craft on it. So that means that crafting early on has very high success rates, and then crafting later on tends to have higher failure rates. Also, just depending on the tier is going to have higher failure rates. So even if you have a relatively low instability, but you're trying to go, especially from tier 4 to tier 5, the max tiers are like kind of on a premium in the sense that they are going to have a higher chance of failing the craft because they want them to be harder to get. And also, the rolls in those higher tiers tend to be highly variable. Like, for example, you see the tier 5 cast speed on this, and it's 15 to 20 range, whereas normally it would probably be like the range before that is probably like 13 to 14 or something relatively minuscule, maybe like 12 to 14. So the last range tends to have like a pretty high peak, but also a really high variance. And if you notice as well, if you see there's 3 mods on this item, and then, but if you look at the top of the item, you see the 35 armor, the range 35 to 35, that's an implicit stat. As you can see, it comes before any of the other mods on the item, and then the +5 to elemental protection is also implicit, and you see the range is 5 to 50 on that. So the implicits can actually have a wide range in this game, and that's part of what makes crafting like really good items difficult, because you have to find good bases first, and good bases require the implicits to be good most of the time. And in this game, there's nothing that can change the implicit value on an item. So keep that in mind when you're looking for crafting bases and stuff like that. So back to the instability. Now, whenever you, if I put this on here, right, and I pick a, let's just pick any mod, right? I'm not using anything. It says we'll add 5 crafting instability to the item, and that's when I go to forge here again, right? So every time you craft something, you're adding 5 instability. Now, in terms of how instability actually works, is it's going to change the success rate for your next craft. So this one, it always tells you the current success rate, right? So it's going to be 73% chance for success, 25% chance for a minor fracture, 2% for a damaging. Now, if I hit this and forge it and it doesn't fracture, which means the item is still good and I can craft on it more, the success chance rate is going to be lower for the next time, basically because it has more instability on it. Now, let's get into the fractures a little bit. So the fracture is when you basically don't get this and you fail. You either get the 25% or the 2% here. So minor fracture is basically just like the item's corrupted in PoE, which means that you can no longer change it or anything like that. You can still wear it. There's no negative bonuses for wearing fractured items. I have a fractured, I believe I have, yeah, see, this is fractured. Thought one of these was fractured. I guess I only have one fractured item on, but it doesn't matter because like there's no penalty for wearing a fractured item. The penalty comes in when you get a damaging fracture, or minor fracture, sorry, is when there's no penalty. Damaging fracture is when the penalty comes in. So what this actually does is it just reduces the tiers like it says here. And I have done this on, I think, 1 item so far, or 2 items. And in both cases, I had like 2 tier 5s and a tier 4, and they literally went down to like 2 tier 1s and a tier 2. So it's pretty bad in most cases. A lot of times you're going to be playing around this, so you're not going to see it come up that often. You're going to have a relatively low chance to damaging fracture most of the time, because the item is just much more likely to fracture in most cases before you get to the point where even the percentage of getting a damaging fracture is high. And a destructive fracture is the worst one, and it just completely ruins the item, and you can't even do anything to augment it at all after that. All the affixes are gone. So, yeah. This is like the worst possible one. It's kind of very hard to actually do this, though. So this is a rare one for sure. Now, something else to mention about instability and just the general crafting philosophy that I've noticed so far is it says that instability represents the damage done to an item by crafting it, right? But you can actually have instability on items that drop from the world. So, for example, let's see if this has any on it. This has 0. This dropped like this. Okay, yeah. So these boots dropped just as they are with the 78 armor and the glancing blow set affix there. And if you alt over them, you can see they already have 4 instability. So I didn't craft anything on this. And I'm pretty sure how this works is like the higher the tier and the more affixes on the item of those tiers results in more instability. Now, I don't think it's the same thing as with crafting, whereas like if you craft something, you put 5 instability on it, right? So I think when this drops, depending on, like, let's say it has, like, there's a certain threshold where it starts to gain instability. Maybe it's tier 3, maybe it's a certain number of mods, a combination of those two. But once it hits that threshold, it's sort of like random to an extent how much instability gets put on the item. There's like a range, and it's not an exact science. So for example, we could have another pair of these exact boots, and maybe they have like 6 instability, or even 8 instability, right? Where they have the same tiers, same mods. I think that's possible, but I haven't really found a case where 2 items have, like, I've noticed that they've dropped the same thing. You know what I mean? I haven't really looked for that yet, or saved them. So that's just kind of a bit of speculation. But what you do notice is that if I were to try and craft both of these mods onto the item, we have a tier 3 and a tier 4. At 5 instability per tier, then we're already like way higher than 4 instability if we're trying to craft from base, right? And there's ways to mitigate the instability while crafting a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a second. But even using those ways where you mitigate, there's no way we could approach 4 instability really while getting a tier 4 glancing blow affix and a tier 3 armor affix on the item, right? So that what that basically means is that unlike in PoE, where you want to a lot of times craft from the base with making, you know, just starting with like a white item or something like that and trying to make it into a good item like that, it's very rare in this case where you ever want to start with a white item. I would say starting with white items is mostly for like newer players that don't have access to a lot of gold, and they're just trying to get a decent item where they can craft a few good rolls, because it's relatively easy to do that. But crafting any sort of good item and starting from white is just not really going to work most of the time, because you're going to be adding so much instability to the item that by the time you get to the end to try and finish it, it's going to have a very high chance of fracturing, right? So you're mostly looking for things like this that drop in the world, or things that come from the gambler, which are basically unidentified item rolls, which then once you buy them, they become identified. So that's kind of how you want to do the crafting in this, I think, for the most part. So that's the bit on stability and instability. Now we have 2 other items that we can use, 2 other sets of items we can use to try and help craft. So the first is going to be glyphs, and we have Glyph of Stability and Glyph of the Guardian. So what Glyph of Stability does, it's relatively simple. You see how it says we'll add 5 crafting instability to an item. If we put Glyph of Stability, it will add 2 to 5 instability to an item. So it basically gives you a chance to lower the instability per instance of crafting. And that's pretty powerful because, like I said, by the end of the item, we want to have as little instability as possible. So when we're trying to get those last good rolls on there, we actually have a reasonable chance of doing it and not completely just breaking the item, right? If you notice, it doesn't change the success rate at all using Glyph of Stability. If I put no glyph in there, it stays 73%. So this only affects the instability going on the item and not the success rate. The other Glyph of the Guardian, is like the opposite. It ensures a higher success rate, but it fixes the instability per attempt at 5. So there's no way you're getting lower instability when you use this. This means that typically when you're crafting an item, you want to start out using Glyph of Stability, especially on the lower tiers that are easier to hit already. And I'll show that in a moment. And then once you get to like the higher tiers, which are harder to hit, those are the ones that you kind of want to use Glyph of the Guardian on in order to ensure that you hit those high rolls. And then towards the end of the item's life cycle, especially if you're trying to craft like an item with 3 good mods and then you don't really care as much about the 4th one, you're probably just going to be slamming Glyph for the Guardian for the 4th mod and just taking it as far as you possibly can with as high of a success rate as you can. So those are the 2 glyphs, and that's how they interact with the stability system and the success rate. And we're going to be showing that in live demonstration in a second, but then I just want to go over the runes a little bit. I want to talk about that other stuff first because these involve some of the instability. So Runic Lensing is basically like a scouring orb in PoE. It brings the item back to white. But in this case, if the item already had a bunch of mods on it and had a decently high instability value, the lowest it can possibly reduce the instability to on the item is 5. So I feel like in a lot of cases, these actually aren't like super useful right now. Because if you have a really high-end item and you scour it into a white item, it's like you're better off just getting another white base with 0 instability rather than having a white base with 5 instability, right? A situation they're kind of useful as if the item already doesn't have any instability but still has mods on it. Like that can happen, like in this case, for example. You see it has 2 mods and 0 instability because it doesn't have like a super high one or something like that. So if you scoured this, it wouldn't add 5 stability. It would just stay at 5 stability. But if it already has over 5 stability, the lowest it can possibly come back to when it gets brought down to white is 5 stability. So that's how Glyph of Cleansing works. It's not typically that useful. Rune of Removal. So this is like an annulment orb in PoE. It removes a random affix from the item. So you can have 4 affixes and it just randomly picks one and removes it. This can be good when you're trying to, maybe you get an item from the Gambler. It has like 2 good mods on it and the third one's kind of bad, or 3 good mods and the fourth one's kind of bad. And you're just taking a shot, basically trying to remove the bad one. These typically, from my experience, they don't add a ton of they don't add a ton of instability, so they're easier to use, right? Rune of Refinement, this is basically like a divine orb in PoE. It rerolls the number value within a tier on all the tiers on the item. Now keep in mind it does not reroll the tier, right? So if you alt over this, it would reroll the cast speed between 15 and 20. It wouldn't like bring it down below 15 or anything like that. And that's how it works with all of the tiers. And then it also doesn't affect the implicit tiers, so it wouldn't affect the elemental protection at all. And if the armor was a variable on this glove, it wouldn't affect that at all either. So just a little note on how that works. These are obviously good for certain things. Typically, you'd use them more towards the end of the item, like when you're finishing it up. One of the exceptions I would say to that is when you're crafting weapons, and we'll maybe see that in a second, is these spell damage rolls, like the cold one here, for example. It actually has a super high variation in the highest tier. And sometimes you're going to want to do like 2 tier 5 damage stats on your weapon, right? And they're both going to have a relatively high variation. So sometimes before you craft like the suffixes, which tend to be defensive, even on weapons, barring like certain things, you're going to want to make sure that your 2 main damage tiers in the prefix department are as high as possible. So you might get them both tier 5, like you might have tier 5 fire damage, tier 5 cold damage, or something on this item, but they might be on the lower end. So you'd want to use a Rune of Refinement before moving on to adding any suffixes, because if you add the suffixes, it adds more instability. It keeps giving you a chance to brick the item, right? So you may brick the item before you get to fix the damage rolls on the prefixes. And yeah, so we'll craft an item here, and we'll get into that a little bit more. We're going to craft the weapon, and we're going to craft the boots. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I think we have enough. Yeah, we have plenty of these. So we're going to start with, actually, what I want to do here, so there's almost no situation where cold damage and fire damage are going to be useful. So, like on the same item. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with one of these Glyph of Removals. So we're going to try and remove the fire damage, and even if we remove the cold damage instead, I'm just going to pretend like we wanted it on there to show you guys how to craft. But we'll see what we get from doing this, right? So we have Rune Removal, Glyph of Stability, because you can still use the Glyph of Stability on the runes. Okay, good. We got rid of the fire damage. Now, we basically just want to start adding the cold damage back, right? And you can see it brought the stability up from 0 to 2. And watch when we use this, it's going to go from anywhere from 4 to 7, basically. To 7. Okay, so we got really unlucky. The glyph stability basically did nothing there. This is basically the time when it starts getting tough in terms of your choices, because now you have a 73% chance for success, which is obviously like pretty decent, but it's not like super good, right? Like there's definitely a reasonable chance you fail this. And the problem is if you start using Glyph of the Guardian now, especially in this case where there's one mod, the odds that you're actually going to be able to finish the item to be anything kind of decent is pretty bad, because there's just like a lot of there's going to be a lot of instability on it, right? If you just keep adding 5. So you need to kind of take the chance in a lot of cases with Glyph stability to try and push the stats higher on the item while keeping the instability low. And unfortunately, sometimes you can still get the +5 instability even when using Glyph stability. But we're just going to hit this again. Okay. So we got max tier 5. That's what the red means. It'll show up in red when you have a essence of the same type that's tier 5 hovered over here, and it's already on the item. So if I go to like put something else here, it goes back to normal color. But yeah, so that's maxed out. And we're gonna put some critical strike multiplier on here, and we're gonna do Glyph of stability. Okay, still pretty low, so we're gonna hit it again. This is interesting. It's like, again, you kind of need to hit this with the Glyph stability, otherwise we're not going to be able to craft anything decent on it. So we're going to go again. Okay, it's pretty damn good. And we're going to transition now, because it's pretty low, right? Like the chance of it is like 63%. So we're going to transition to using Glyph of the Guardian to try and finish off the crit multi. And we fractured. Okay. So it's a minor fracture, which means I could still equip the item. We didn't lose any tiers on the item or anything, but unfortunately this weapon just pales in comparison to my actual weapon right here, right? We weren't able to improve it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a Rune of Shattering, because the crit multi shards are quite rare. And the higher the tier on the shards, or the affix right here, the more likely the number of shards you're going to get returned is like greater. So we're probably going to get hopefully multiple cold shards and multiple multi shards from this. And this kind of helps recoup a bit of your crafting investment into the item. So that's always good. So we'll use a Rune of Shattering. Rune of Shatterings are kind of rare, so you don't want to just use them like on anything. You're trying to target mostly like rare affix shards. So we shattered it. We only got 1 crit multiplier shard. Okay, that's pretty bad RNG. Something else about the Rune of Shattering is obviously when you're shattering an item, it can't give you any affixes from an item, or any shards for an affix that's not on the item. So having a case like that with that wand is usually really good, because both of those shards are useful to me. And those are the only types of shards you can get from the dismantle. But we just kind of got unlucky there. And at the end of the day, RNG is RNG, right? So next thing we're going to do is we're going to craft some boots here. And yeah, so we need the Sight Glancing Blow on these if they're going to be usable. So we're just going to try and bring that to tier 5. And if we get this done, we might be able to make a really good pair of boots. Okay, that's pretty damn good. So those are maxed out. I'm gonna go and get the armor, the suffix armor. We're gonna again hit it with instability here, or stability. Okay. We're going to At this point, I think I want to Guardian it to get the tier 5. And then we're going to go and movement speed. And we're going to go for stability again. And I think we're going to go stability one more time. And then we're going to try and cap out the movement speed with Guardian. Okay. Tier 3. And then this is the crux here. And then depending on what we get, hopefully we do hit this, because I want to show maybe using the Refinement. And unfortunately we did fracture there. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to hopefully get the movement speed roll, and I can just show it easily, is that as you can see, it's 16 to 19 movement speed tier 4, but when you get to tier 5, it's 20 to 25. So it's a bit of a bigger range, and the armor was decent. As you can see, 121 to 180, but not like anywhere near perfect or anything. And the glancing blow per equipped item with this affix goes only from 6 to 7. So this would have been a really good candidate to use the Runic Refinement on to try and re-roll the numbers on the affixes within the tiers, right? So that's all I was going to do there. But sometimes the items brick, and there's nothing really you can do about it. But, so yeah, I think we use Runa Removal, we use Runa Shattering. Runic Lensing's like super intuitive anyway, and I just explained again what Runic Refinement does. So that's pretty much all the tools you have in your tool belt and for crafting, and that's like the basic crafting strategies. I'd say things to just refresh, to keep in mind is that, again, you never really want to craft on a white item. Like, to make it a good item, you can craft on it, you know, just to get decent rolls on it, to have a piece of gear if you have a really bad slot or something, but you never want to, like, reliably try and craft a super good item from a white item. You're always going to try and find your bases in the wild or through the gambler with the mods you need and relatively low instability compared to the tiers that they have on them. And then when crafting lower tiers, especially when there's not many mods on the item and your success rate is high, you always want to be using Glyph of Stability to try and add less instability on the item. You kind of have to think of it as like, yeah, you're taking a chance by doing Glyph of Stability, but if you just keep adding 5 all the time, you're never going to be able to finish the item realistically. So you basically need to get, one, lucky that you don't brick the item without the help of Glyph of the Guardian on the lower rolls, and then also that when you're boosting up those lower rolls, you're adding not a lot of stability each time. So you kind of need the RNG to make the successful craft, and then you need the RNG where your Glyph of Stability is helping you out a lot and giving you hopefully like 2 to 3 instability per craft instead of 5, right? And, you know, crafting in any game is alwait's RNG, so it's what makes it fun, exciting, interesting, right? And nothing you can really do about that. So I think those are the main tips, I would say. And if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you liked and this helped you, think about liking it or subscribing it. If you didn't like it, feel free to dislike it. And yeah, I'll see you guys later. You can catch me on Twitch at twitch.tv/talks_phobos. Link should be in the description. Thank you guys very much, and